The hallway went dead silent when the woman on the floor whispered his name. Nobody in that building understood why the most powerful man in Philadelphia had just gone white. Cyrus Dracos was 38 years old, and in 6 years at the head of his family's organization, no one had ever seen him raise his voice. He didn't have to. He walked into Ridgeline Care Center that Tuesday morning through the side entrance, 20 minutes early, alone, and that's when he heard a meal tray hit the floor. He turned the corner and found a woman in her 20s, sitting on the ground with both arms wrapped over her head, an empty tray still spinning beside her, and a day shift aide standing over her with a folded leather belt in his hand. Cyrus didn't shout, but the moment he spoke, the woman on the floor went completely still, because she knew that voice. She lifted her face, looked straight at him, and whispered 3 words that made a room full of strangers stop breathing. And what Cyrus whispered back to the man holding that belt would make the blood drain from his face in seconds. What he did in the next 90 seconds is the reason people at Ridgeline still won't talk about that morning. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let us know what you think. A like helps more people find stories like this one, and sharing it with someone who needs it today means more than you know. Subscribe and tap the bell so the next story finds you. Now let's go back to that Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, and the 90 seconds that changed everything. At 5:50 on Tuesday morning, Chloe Whitaker had already been standing in the medication room at Ridgeline Care Center for 40 minutes, and she'd been inside the building since 10 o'clock the night before. Her third shift ended at 6. Her first shift began at 6. They called it a double shift, and on the staffing schedule posted on the wall, her name appeared 3 times in the same week. 22 residents in the East and West Wings, 1 practical nurse. That number wasn't printed anywhere on the glossy brochure the residents' families received when they came for their first visit. Chloe knew the number because she was the number. She poured the medications into each small plastic cup, checked the name, checked the dosage, initialed the column on the right. Her fingers trembled slightly from her 4th coffee, but her hands didn't miss a single cup. They hadn't missed a single cup in 4 months. When she pushed the medication cart out of the room, she stopped at the staff cafeteria, where the breakfast trays had been laid out since 5:30. She took hers, an egg sandwich, and a small carton of milk, and ate exactly half of the sandwich while standing, her eyes still fixed on the staffing schedule. She wrapped the other half in a paper napkin, folded it neatly, then slipped it into the inside pocket of her lab coat. She did it quickly and didn't look at anyone. Over the past 4 months, she'd learned that if something could be done in 3 seconds, no one had time to ask questions. Before pushing the cart away, she opened the meal log and turned to the page for the East Wing, room 12. In the last 7 days, there were 3 entries saying the exact same thing, written in the same handwriting that slanted to the right. Refused food. Chloe stared at those 3 words longer than necessary. She had sat beside the woman in room 12 on Saturday afternoons, when her shift was over, but she still didn't want to go back to the empty room she rented. And she knew exactly what happened when you placed a cookie in that woman's palm. The woman in room 12 didn't refuse food. The woman in room 12 ate everything she was given, ate quickly, and always glanced toward the door while she ate. Chloe closed the log. She didn't write anything else in it. She'd learned that lesson too. As she pushed the medication cart through the connecting hallway, she looked up at the camera box mounted in the ceiling corner where the corridor turned into the East Wing. The indicator light beneath it was still dark. It had been dark for 7 weeks. In the staff meeting minutes from the previous month, the item was listed as awaiting repair, and in the staff meeting minutes from the month before that, it had also been listed as awaiting repair. Chloe had asked Ruth Hollis about it once, and the director had answered in the voice of someone too busy answering another question, saying that the maintenance contractor had its own schedule and the center couldn't interfere. Chloe didn't ask a second time, but she had written 2 reports about Wade Toller. The first had been in May, after she saw him yank a resident's arm harder than necessary to pull the person upright. The second had been in June, longer, with the date, the time, and the names of the witnesses. She submitted both to the office, according to procedure, on the proper forms. There was no response to the first. The response to the second was a 10-minute meeting in Mrs. Hollis's office, during which the director reminded her that they were severely understaffed, that Toller had worked there for 8 years, and that accusations like these, without evidence, could hurt everyone involved, including the person who wrote them. She said the last part very gently. Chloe understood it. She'd heard almost the exact same sentence once before, in another place, in another year, and she knew exactly what happened afterward. So she nodded, thanked Mrs. Hollis, walked out, and from that day on, she didn't submit another report. That morning, the staffing schedule had placed her at the other end of the building. West Wing, morning medication round, 11 rooms. Toller was assigned to the East Wing. Chloe had seen it on the board the night before and had thought about it through the entire overnight shift, and she'd told herself that by 7:15 she would be finished with the West Wing. Then she would circle over to the East Wing with half a sandwich in her coat pocket, just as she always did. 7:15 was too late. She was standing in room 4 of the West Wing, a medication cup in her hand, reading the name of the medication aloud to a resident according to procedure, when the sound reached her. It wasn't a bell. It wasn't someone calling for help. It was a man's voice shouting one short sentence, and it was loud enough to carry through 2 hallways and a half-closed door. Chloe set the medication cup down on the cart. She told the resident in front of her that she'd be right back. Then she pushed the medication cart against the wall, locked the wheels, left it there, and ran toward the East Wing. The woman on the floor lifted her face, and her voice broke into a whisper that everyone in the hallway could hear. "Sigh. You're late." No one in that hallway understood what those 3 words meant. Wade Toller heard them, and he gave a short laugh, the kind of laugh that came from a man used to hearing meaningless things from the people who lived in this building. But the man who had just turned the corner of the hallway didn't laugh. He stood still. His hands hung at his sides, not clenched, not raised. Then he began walking forward. He didn't move quickly. He took 4 steps. And during those 4 steps, no one in the hallway said a word. Not the 2 residents standing close to the doorway of the next room, not the maintenance worker who had stopped sweeping in the middle of a stroke. Toller watched him approach and didn't step back. Because Toller was half a head taller and about 66 pounds heavier. And because in 8 years of working at Ridgeline, no one had ever walked toward him that way. The man stopped in front of him, closer than a stranger had any right to stand. Then he reached out and took hold of the belt. He didn't yank it away. He simply closed his fingers around the doubled leather in Toller's hand and drew it out slowly, the way someone might take a pen from a child scribbling on a wall, and Toller let it slide from his grip without understanding why he was allowing it. The man held the belt and rolled it up. He rolled it neatly, 2 turns, 3 turns, tucked the buckle inside, in the manner of someone who had rolled something like this thousands of times in his life. Then he held it out, palm facing upward, offering it back to Toller. Toller didn't take it. The man kept his hand extended, and at last Toller raised his hand and accepted it, and as the belt passed from one hand to the other, the man leaned forward, tilted his face toward Toller's ear, and said one sentence. It was very short. No one else heard it. The maintenance worker, standing about 13 feet away, later testified that she hadn't heard a single word, only seen the man's lips move for less time than it took to draw one breath. What everyone saw was what happened next. The blood drained from Wade Toller's face. It happened so quickly that they could watch it occur, from his cheeks up toward his forehead, and he stepped backward once, then again, and the second step drove his back into the hallway wall. The belt slipped from his hand and fell to the floor for the second time that morning, but this time no one looked at it. Toller stood pressed against the wall, his mouth slightly open, and he said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't ask who the man was. The man had already turned his back on him before Toller could even think to ask. He turned toward the woman on the floor, and there, the man who had just made another man half again his size freeze against a wall, the man who had taken 4 steps, without a trace of hesitation, suddenly stopped. He looked down at her. She was still sitting flat on the vinyl floor, both knees drawn up, one hand still resting on top of her head as though she'd forgotten she was allowed to lower it now. The man raised one hand slowly and unfastened the top button of his jacket. Then he knelt down. He knelt completely. One knee and then both, onto the floor where milk from the tray had spread into a pale stain among scattered crumbs, and the dark fabric of his suit touched the ground without him looking at it even once. He lowered his shoulders until they were below hers. He sat there on the floor, and he didn't say his name. He simply extended his right hand, opened his palm, and held it suspended about 8 inches from hers. That hand didn't tremble, but it stopped at exactly that distance, and couldn't move any closer. She looked at the hand. For 2 seconds, she stared at it, and didn't react. Then something broke inside her eyes, and she screamed. It wasn't the scream of someone in pain. It was high, long, and it didn't stop. And it struck the 2 hallway walls and came rushing back. She recoiled. digging her heels into the floor to push herself away, both arms rising again to cover her head, and she screamed until there was no breath left in her lungs, then drew another breath and screamed again. The man didn't pull his hand away. He didn't move it closer either. He sat motionless on the floor with his open palm suspended in the space between them, and there was nothing on his face, nothing anyone in that hallway could put a name to, and one of them later said that was what frightened her more than the screaming. The sound of running footsteps came from the far end of the hallway. Fast, very fast, shoe soles squealing against the floor at the turn. And then a woman's voice cut through everything, sharp and clear, without the slightest tremor. "Get your hands off her." Chloe Whitaker didn't stop to get a good look at the man kneeling on the floor. She went straight past him, and on her final step, she did something that, whenever she thought about it later, still sent a chill down her spine. She turned her back on him. She pivoted, placing herself between him and the woman on the floor, then lowered herself down. She didn't kneel. She sat flat on the vinyl floor, lower even than the woman curled against the base of the wall, and rested both hands on her thighs, palms turned upward, empty. The screaming was still going on. Chloe didn't tell her to be quiet. She didn't say everything was all right, and she didn't tell her to calm down. She simply began to count. 5. She counted in a low, steady voice, each number separated by one long breath. 4. The scream shortened, then broke apart into sobs. 3. Chloe didn't look directly into her face. She looked down at the floor between them, so her own gaze wouldn't become one more thing the woman had to endure. 2. She extended one hand, touching no one, and simply placed it on the floor about 8 inches from the other woman's foot, her palm still facing upward. 1. The hallway went quiet. The woman on the floor dragged in a ragged breath, then lunged forward and grabbed the sleeve of Chloe's lab coat. She didn't take Chloe's hand. She grabbed the fabric, gripped it hard, twisted it inside her fist, and held on that way. Chloe let her. She sat motionless on the floor while a 24-year-old woman clung to her sleeve, and she began counting again from 5, more slowly this time. The man in the dark suit was still kneeling about 6.5 feet away. He didn't stand. He didn't say a word. He watched the small hand twist around the nurse's sleeve, watched the way the nurse never once pulled her arm away. And he remained there long enough for 2 more staff members to come running, long enough for the sobs to grow farther apart and finally stop. When they helped the woman to her feet and guided her back to room 12, she still didn't release Chloe's sleeve, and Chloe walked beside her all the way down the hallway, slightly bent over so she could stay at the right height. Chloe didn't look back even once. She didn't know who the man was. She hadn't had time to care. Out in the east parking lot, Elias Vance stood beside the black car with a tablet in his hand and checked his watch for the 3rd time. When Cyrus Dracos came out through the side door, Vance began speaking before he had even reached him. The center's delegation was waiting in the main lobby. The reporter from the local paper would arrive at 9 o'clock with a photographer. The $2 million check had already been signed, clearly designated for the Long-Term Care Facility Improvement Fund. 40 minutes, 3 photographs, 1 4-line statement already prepared, then straight to the airport. Vance spoke quickly and precisely, like a man who had delivered this same schedule 3 times in 2 days. He added one more thing in a lower voice, saying the federal prosecutor's office had sent a second subpoena for records that month, and Special Agent Karen Mercer was building the case under an organized crime theory, focusing on the logistics operations around the Port District. Vance said every public appearance over the past 3 months had been constructed exactly according to the attorney's recommendations, and that this morning was the most important link in that chain. Cyrus didn't answer right away. He stood beside the car door with one hand resting on the roof, and looked back toward the low, pale brick building behind him. Cancel everything. Vance stopped talking. He lowered the tablet about 3/4 of an inch, then raised it again. He asked once more, carefully, whether Cyrus wanted to move it to the afternoon or postpone it until the following week. Cyrus said, "Don't move it. Cancel it." Vance was silent for 3 seconds. He was the only person in the organization allowed to ask a second question, and he asked it. He reminded Cyrus that if they canceled now, the press would start asking questions. And if the press asked questions, Mercer's office would see those questions before lunch, and everything they had built over the past 3 months would turn into a question mark inside the case file. He said this wasn't a photo opportunity. It was a shield. Cyrus turned and looked at him. In 6 years beside this man, Elias Vance had learned how to read silences, and he knew exactly which kind meant Cyrus was considering something, and which kind meant the decision was finished. This was the second kind. Cyrus pulled the check from inside his jacket, folded it in half, and handed it to Vance. He told him to keep it. He told him to send the reporter home. He told him to tell the center's delegation that something urgent had come up and not explain anything else. Then he fastened the button of his jacket again, the same button he had undone in the hallway 10 minutes earlier, and he spoke the final sentence so evenly that Vance had to wait another beat before he was sure he'd heard correctly. "Have someone moved the car out of the lot?" Vance asked where he was going. Cyrus didn't answer. He had already turned away and was walking back toward the side door, and he was moving faster than he had when he came out. Chloe left room 12 at 7:20, after the woman inside had finally agreed to lie down and release the sleeve of her coat. The fabric was still deeply wrinkled where she'd held it. Chloe walked toward the staff break room at the end of the hallway, pushed open the door, and found the man in the suit standing inside. He wasn't sitting. He stood beside the table with his back to the window, and Chloe had no idea how long he'd been there. She closed the door behind her. She should have called security. She should have asked what right he had to be in a staff-only area, but she'd gone through 90 sleepless minutes in her second consecutive shift, and something in the way this man stood made her understand that calling security wouldn't change anything. He asked his first question. "How long has she been here?" Chloe could answer that one. 11 months. She said the number aloud and saw something pass across his face and disappear, so quickly she couldn't name it. He asked his second question. "Who brought her here?" Chloe said she didn't know. He didn't blink, didn't repeat the question, simply waited, and she realized she was explaining herself even though no one had asked her to. She said some residents' admission files were kept under restricted access, that practical nurses like her could only open the daily care section, medications, allergies, vital signs, while the sections for next of kin, source of payment, and legal documents sat behind another password layer. He asked who could open that layer. Chloe gave him the name Dr. Adrian Pike, the medical director. She added that he didn't work at Ridgeline full-time, that he oversaw several facilities at once, and was only there once or twice a month. He asked his third question, who pays? And this time, Chloe remained silent longer than she had after the first two questions combined. She said that one evening in April, she had once seen the top of a printed form that had been left behind on the printer. On it were the words, "Court-appointed guardian," along with a signature she couldn't read, and the name in the ward field was Nina Hale. She said every document connected to room 12 went through that signature, and she'd never seen another name appear beside it. She said she'd never seen the person who signed those papers come to visit even once in the 4 months she'd worked there. The man looked down at the tabletop for a moment. Then he asked whether she could speak. Chloe said she could speak, but she didn't. She said that during 11 months at Ridgeline, the woman in room 12 had never initiated a conversation with anyone. She answered yes and no. She named objects. She knew Saturday afternoons were the afternoons when someone stayed behind to sit with her, but beyond those things, she was silent. Chloe paused, then continued with the part she believed mattered most, and she spoke in the voice of someone giving a warning rather than telling a story. She said that when the woman panicked, sometimes very old fragments came out, a name, a line from a song, a sentence someone had said a long time ago. They surfaced for a few seconds and then sank again, and afterward she couldn't hold on to any of it, not even the fact that she'd just said those words. Chloe said she'd witnessed it exactly 3 times, and all 3 times it happened when someone shouted in the hallway. Chloe looked directly at the man in front of her. "So, if you heard something this morning, don't expect her to remember it." The man said nothing for a very long time. Then he reached inside his jacket, took out a leather wallet, opened it, and pulled a photograph from the innermost compartment. The photograph was old, its edges worn round at 2 corners, the kind of wear that came from something being taken out and put away again many times over many years. He set it on the table and pushed it toward her. In the photograph, a young woman stood in front of a stone step, her hair tied high, smiling at whoever held the camera. Chloe looked at the photograph. She picked it up. She brought it closer, then placed it back on the table, and said nothing for long enough to hear the coffee machine hiss in the corner of the room. She turned the photograph over. There was nothing written on the back. She asked what year it had been taken. He said when she was 22. Chloe placed both hands on the edge of the table. She said the file listed the woman in room 12 as Nina Hale, 24 years old, no relatives, transferred from a facility in another county. She said she'd read that line no fewer than 100 times. The man picked up the photograph, looked at it, then slid it back into the innermost compartment of his wallet, and he did it very slowly, as though moving any faster would cause something to break. "There is no Nina Hale." He said it so evenly that Chloe needed a moment to understand the weight of it. Then he fastened his jacket, lifted his eyes, and looked directly at her. "Her name is Nadia Dracos, and I buried her 11 months ago." Chloe didn't ask another question. She stood still until the man had left the break room, waited until the sound of his footsteps disappeared completely around the corner, then walked straight into the supply closet and closed the door behind her. The supply closet was the only place in the building without a window facing the hallway. She leaned her back against the shelving stacked with diapers and towels, pulled out her phone, and typed a single word into the search bar: Dracos. The first result was a long article about the Southern Port District. The second was a photograph of a man walking out of the federal building on Market Street, one hand fastening the button of his coat, and Chloe recognized the gesture before she recognized the face. The third was an analysis piece from the local newspaper, complete with diagrams, arrows, and words like organized crime, money laundering, and a 3-year federal investigation that had yet to produce an indictment. She read the entire third article. Then she reread the middle section, the part that said 3 witnesses had been subpoenaed and none of them had ever taken the stand. When she lifted the phone to scroll farther down, the screen trembled slightly, and she looked down and realized it was her hand that was shaking. She placed the phone face down on the shelf and stood there breathing in the darkness. She thought about the small hand twisting around her sleeve that morning. She thought about how, for 11 months, the person signing every document for Room 12 had never once walked through that door. And she thought about the thing she didn't want to think, that the man who had just stood across a table from her might be the only person in the world powerful enough to pull Nadia out of Ridgeline, and he might also be the man who would take her somewhere no one would ever be allowed to ask about again. There was no way to know. There was no one to ask. The only person with the authority to answer was Dr. Adrian Pike, and Pike was the one who had locked the file in the first place. And Chloe knew exactly what happened to people like her when they chose wrong. 2 years earlier, she had filled out a form. She had sat at the dining table in her old apartment for 4 hours trying to write it correctly. Without emotion, without speculation, only dates, times, and what she had seen with her own eyes, and she had signed her real name at the bottom, instead of checking the anonymous box, because she had been taught that a report carried more weight when a person put their real name behind it. The doctor named in that form was still practicing medicine. Chloe wasn't. 7 weeks later, Human Resources called her upstairs and handed her a piece of paper saying she had violated patient information handling procedures, and they spoke slowly, politely, using exactly the same tone Ruth Hollis had used with her in the director's office that past June. Her registered nursing program that year had been half funded by the hospital. That half disappeared with the job. The balance still owed for her mother's treatment was $61,400, and that didn't disappear with it. She spent 20 months working for temporary staffing agencies. 3 days at one facility, 2 days at another, night shifts, weekend shifts, places where no one asked why she had left her old hospital, because they didn't need to know who she was either. Ridgeline was the first place in those 20 months to call her back a second time. Chloe picked the phone up from the shelf. She didn't reopen the browser. She opened her photo folders and scrolled all the way down to the one she'd named Shift Charts, the dullest name she could think of. Inside were 27 videos. The first had been recorded in April and lasted 11 seconds, filmed through the crack of the dining room door. The longest ran 1 minute and 4 seconds. In some, no one's face was visible, only an arm and a voice. In others, everything was very clear. She had recorded them with the phone hidden inside the pocket of her lab coat, the same pocket where she hid half an egg sandwich every morning. And she had started filming after realizing her second report was going nowhere. She hadn't sent any of the videos to anyone. Not to administration, because she had already tried following procedure twice and learned where that led. Not to the state regulatory agency, because her name would appear on the whistleblower line, and once a name had appeared on that line before, no one called back the second time. Not to the police, because she had looked it up and knew they would ask why she had secretly recorded inside a medical facility. And the right answer wasn't necessarily the answer that would save her. So the 27 videos stayed hidden inside a folder called Shift Charts, and every night before she went to sleep, Chloe checked to make sure they were still there And every morning she went back to work with the phone in her pocket. And she remained the only person in that building who knew exactly what was happening in the east hallway and still couldn't do anything about it. Elias Vance received the call at 10:15 and arrived at the meeting place 40 minutes later. Cyrus didn't ask whether he had brought the documents. He said only one thing: "Tell me about the funeral." Vance sat down across from him and began, because he was the only person who could tell the story. On the night of September 19th, the previous year, a fire broke out in a rental property on Willow Court, northwest of the city. 3 people died. 2 were identified that same night. The third wasn't. Vance said the medical examiner's office had kept the case open for 4 days. And during those 4 days, they cross-checked it against the list of missing persons in the region. Cyrus asked who had put Nadia's name on that list. Vance said he had filed the missing person report on the morning of September 20th, after the facility where she had been staying called, and said she wasn't present during the evening head count. Cyrus asked which facility. Vance named a center in Delaware County, and said it had shut down 10 months later. Cyrus showed no reaction to that detail. He told him to continue. Vance said that on the 4th day, the medical examiner's office announced that they had grounds for identification. Nadia's dental records and medical records had been sent over by a doctor, along with written confirmation that she was a patient under his care. Cyrus asked for the name. Vance opened the file, found the page, and read it aloud. Adrian Pike. Cyrus said nothing for 6 seconds. Then he asked if Vance had seen her. Vance looked up. He understood what the question meant. He said no. He said the medical examiner's office had advised against visual identification because of the condition of the body, that the recommendation had been put in writing, and that in accordance with that recommendation, the casket remained closed from beginning to end. He said he was the one who had signed the approval for that. Cyrus asked why he had been the one to sign. Vance was silent for a moment, then answered that Cyrus hadn't been there. He recounted that week without adding or omitting anything. September of the previous year had been the week Cyrus was in the middle of a transition within the organization. 3 consecutive days without leaving one building. His phone turned off, every matter outside handled by someone else. Vance said he had chosen the cemetery, chosen the casket, arranged the funeral, and given Cyrus the list for final approval on the 4th day. Cyrus said he remembered that list. He said he had signed it without reading it. Vance said nothing more about that. Cyrus asked the next question. Where is Adrian Pike now? Vance had already checked. He said Pike was the medical director of a group of 6 intermediate care facilities for people with intellectual disabilities in the eastern part of the state, all registered under a single management company, and Ridgeline was one of the 6. He said Pike had held the position for 4 years, approved medical records for all 6 facilities, and was the highest professional authority in the entire network. Cyrus asked who owned the management company. Vance said the ownership structure ran through 3 layers of limited liability companies registered in 2 different states, and that he needed more time. Cyrus told him to take more time. Then Vance turned to the final page in the file and said there was one thing he thought Cyrus should know before thinking any further. He said that morning, after the call, he had gone back through the family trust. Cyrus asked why. Vance said because every death certificate triggered a procedure, and every procedure left a trail. He said that under the trust established by Cyrus's grandfather, Nadia's share had been structured as a lifetime care fund, with the principal protected and only the income or distributions permitted for her treatment and living needs, and the beneficiary had no authority to dispose of the assets herself. He said the accompanying clause clearly stated that if the beneficiary died, the entire remaining principal would transfer to another branch of the family. Cyrus asked who received it. Vance looked down at the page, then back up. He said the transfer had been completed 41 days after the funeral, that the filing was complete, with a copy of the death certificate attached, and that he didn't want to say the name in the recipient field out loud until he had finished checking the second layer. Cyrus said fine. Vance closed the file. He asked where Cyrus wanted to start. Cyrus didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the tabletop, at the empty space where the file had just been, and arranged the 3 pieces that had just been placed beside one another in his mind. One man had signed the confirmation that she was dead. The same man had spent 4 years approving medical records for 6 facilities. And one of those 6 facilities was where she had been lying for 11 months under another name. Then he said the only sentence Vance later copied word for word into his notebook that night, so she never left the hands of the man who signed her death certificate. Ruth Hollis called Wade Toller into the director's office at 11 o'clock. She had already made 3 phone calls, and none of them had given her the answer she wanted to hear. She knew something had happened in the east hallway. She knew a stranger had been inside the building at 7 that morning. And she knew the delegation had canceled its morning schedule without giving a reason, leaving a reporter standing in the main lobby for 40 minutes. She told Toller to sit down and asked him what had happened. Toller sat. He began talking about how the resident in room 12 had taken food from someone else's tray, how he'd warned her more than once, how rules were rules. Ruth Hollis cut him off and asked why he'd been holding a belt in his hand. Toller said he'd taken it off because it was getting in the way. Ruth Hollis looked at him for a moment, then asked the next question. "What did that man say to you?" And here Toller fell silent. He licked his lips. He looked down at his hands. Then he said the man had only said 2 words. Ruth Hollis asked what 2 words. Toller said them, quietly, and he stammered on the second word. He said my name. Ruth Hollis didn't understand. She asked again. Toller repeated it, more slowly this time, and now she heard him clearly. The man had leaned toward his ear and said 2 words. Wade Toller. His full name, exactly as it appeared on payroll, exactly as it appeared on the employee badge hanging from his chest, though the badge had been turned backward since morning because the lanyard had twisted. Toller said the man spoke his name as if he were writing it down somewhere. He said he'd never met that man in his life, had never spoken to him, and couldn't understand how he knew. No threat, no promise, not another word afterward. He had simply said his name, then turned away. Toller said he'd remained standing in the hallway for several minutes after the man left, and during those minutes he couldn't think about anything except the fact that the man knew who he was. Ruth Hollis sat without speaking. She had managed care facilities for 19 years, and she understood immediately that this story didn't end in the east hallway. She opened a drawer, took out a form, and began writing as she spoke. She said the center was documenting a serious incident involving inappropriate conduct toward a resident. She said his employment was terminated effective that day. Toller shot to his feet. He said he'd worked there for 8 years. He said she herself had told him the facility was short-staffed, and everyone had to put up with a little more. He said there were 2 reports about him sitting in her own drawer, and she'd never done anything about either of them. He asked if they suddenly mattered now. Ruth Hollis didn't look up. She said she was sorry. She pushed the paper across the desk and told him to sign the box at the bottom. She said his access badge had to be returned before he left the building. Toller looked at the paper. Then he signed it, because he understood there was nothing left for him to bargain with in that room. He left the director's office at 11:23, walked through the lobby, returned his badge to the receptionist, and stepped out into the employee parking lot behind the building. He got into his car and didn't start the engine. He sat there for about 5 minutes, with both hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about those 2 words. Then he pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, scrolled down to a number with no name attached to it, only 3 letters, and pressed call. He'd had that number for 11 months. He'd been told to call only if something happened that was worth calling about. Never to text, never to call twice, and in 11 months he'd never used it, because the money kept arriving in his account every month without him having to do anything except keep an eye on one room and report back if anyone started asking questions about it. The phone rang 4 times. Then someone answered and said nothing. Toller gave his name first. Then he said the sentence he'd rehearsed in his head during those 5 minutes in the car. Dracos just came to my workplace. The other end stayed silent. Toller kept going, faster now, his voice rising slightly. He said Dracos had come that morning without warning and entered through the side door. He said Dracos had stood in the east hallway. Then he said the final sentence, lowering his voice when he spoke it even though there was no one else in the parking lot. There's a girl here he cares about. The person on the other end didn't ask which girl. He didn't ask how Toller knew. He didn't ask a single question. Toller heard breathing, then the sound of a glass being set down on wood, followed by complete silence. He counted 10 seconds. During those 10 seconds, he began wondering whether he'd just made a mistake. Then the voice came through, the voice of an older man, deep, slow, without the slightest trace of panic. The voice of someone who had just heard news he'd been waiting a long time to hear. He said exactly 2 sentences. Move the girl. Tonight. Cyrus Dracos returned to Ridgeline at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Visiting hours ended at 3:30. He knew that because it was printed on the sign beside the main entrance, and he walked in anyway. The receptionist looked at him, looked at the sign, then called someone. 3 minutes later, Chloe Whitaker came out into the lobby. She was still wearing the uniform from her morning shift, because she'd now been inside the building for 18 straight hours. She stopped 3 steps away from him and said he wasn't allowed in. Cyrus asked why. Chloe said visiting hours were over. She said his name wasn't on the approved visitor list for the resident in room 12. She said that even if his name were on it, she still wouldn't let him in that afternoon, because the woman had panicked for more than 20 minutes that morning and had needed nearly the entire day to settle down, and Chloe wasn't going to let that happen again on the same day. Cyrus didn't respond to any of those 3 statements. He looked past her shoulder toward the hallway, then looked back at her. Then he did something Chloe hadn't expected. He walked over to the row of plastic chairs along the lobby wall, the ones meant for family members who were waiting, and sat down. He didn't say anything else. Chloe stood there for a few more seconds, then turned and went back inside. At 4:20, she crossed the lobby, and he was still sitting there. At 5 o'clock, she passed through again to collect paperwork from the front desk, and he was still there in the same position, both hands resting on his thighs. No phone, no glances at the clock. Twice the receptionist stood as though she meant to say something, then sat back down without speaking. At 6 o'clock, when the afternoon shift gave way to the night shift and the hallways began to empty, Chloe came into the lobby for the 3rd time. He was still there. She stopped in front of him and asked how long he intended to sit there. Cyrus said he'd sit until she changed her mind, or until the building closed, whichever came first. Chloe said nobody there changed their mind because someone sat around refusing to leave. Cyrus said he knew. He said he wasn't sitting there to pressure her. He said he was sitting there because there was nowhere else he needed to be. Chloe looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down 2 chairs away from him, not in the chair beside him, and placed the file on her lap. She said she'd let him in. Not today. Tomorrow, after breakfast, when the woman was at her clearest, and only for 15 minutes. But she said that if he wanted to go in, he had to follow her rules, and she was going to give him 4 of them, and if he didn't agree to all 4, then there would be no visit. Cyrus told her to go ahead. Chloe gave him the first rule. He had to sit lower than her. No standing. No bending over her. No pulling up a chair. Sit all the way down on the floor if she was sitting on the floor. She said people had stood over her for 11 months, and she'd learned that whoever stood higher was the one giving orders. Second, don't wear black. Chloe didn't explain that one. She only said that if he came wearing black, she wouldn't open the door. Third, don't block the doorway. Don't stand between her and the exit. Don't sit on the doorway side of the room. Don't make her walk around him if she wanted to leave. Chloe said the person in that room always had to be able to see her way out. Then Chloe gave him the 4th rule, and she said it more slowly than the first 3. If she says no, it means no. If she turns away, if she pushes your hand aside, if she simply sits there and won't look at you, the visit is over, and you leave. Don't plead. Don't try again. Don't ask me to persuade her for you. Chloe looked directly at him when she said the last part. Even you. Cyrus Draco sat without moving. In 6 years, no one had placed conditions on him. People made proposals. People negotiated. People asked permission. No one had ever sat 2 plastic chairs away from him in a fluorescent-lit lobby and read out 4 rules he had to follow if he wanted to see his sister. He thought about that longer than Chloe expected. Then he nodded. He said all right. Chloe asked whether he was sure he understood the 4th rule. Cyrus said he understood. Chloe stood, tucked the file beneath her arm, and said 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the side entrance to the east wing, and she'd come out to meet him. Then she walked 3 steps, stopped, and turned back. She said there was something she wanted to ask. Something she'd intended not to ask but was going to anyway. She said that in 11 months, the woman had reacted most strongly to 2 things. The first was people shouting in the hallway. The second was men in suits. Chloe said that once in May, a state inspector came for a routine inspection wearing a dark suit, and he only passed by the door of room 12 without stopping, but she had backed herself into the corner of the room and stayed there for 4 hours. Chloe said she'd written it in the observation log, and no one had ever been able to explain it to her. Then she asked her question. Do you know why? Cyrus Dracos didn't answer. He looked at her, and he held that expression long enough for Chloe to understand that he did know, and long enough for her to understand that he wasn't going to say it that night. Then he stood, fastened the button of his coat, and walked out the door. At 8:45 the next morning, Cyrus Drakos was standing at the side entrance to the east wing. He wore a light gray shirt, no jacket, no tie. Chloe came out to meet him exactly on time, looked at what he was wearing for 1 second, and made no comment. She said Nadia was eating breakfast and they had 10 minutes to sit outside before going in. They sat on the stone bench beneath the awning. Chloe opened the lid of her coffee and said she had been thinking about the question from the night before all night long. Cyrus said nothing. Then he began to speak, and he spoke in the voice of a man reading a report about someone else. He said it had happened 6 years ago. He said he was 32 then, and Nadia was 18. He said that day was the last day of final exams at her school, that she was supposed to take her final exam at 9 o'clock, and he was the one driving her there. He said he still drove her to school on the days he was in the city, and that it was something he'd done since she was little. He said that morning she went out to the car first. She always went out first, always sat in the passenger seat, always changed the radio to the station he hated. He said he had gotten up to go out with her when the phone rang. Chloe asked what the call had been about. Cyrus said it was someone connected to his family's business, calling to ask his opinion about something that could have waited until the afternoon. He said he answered anyway. He said the call lasted 3 minutes. He fell silent for a moment, then said he remembered that number because the timing had been documented afterward, and 3 minutes was the distance between the moment she got into the car and the moment he reached the door. He didn't describe anything else about what happened in the parking lot that morning. He only said it hadn't been meant for her. It had been meant for that car, and for the person who was supposed to be sitting in the driver's seat at 8:45. He said the men who did it came in another car, that they wore dark suits, and that they stood there long enough for her to see them through the glass. Chloe set her coffee down on the stone bench and didn't pick it up again. Cyrus said she survived. He said her heart stopped before the ambulance arrived, and they got it beating again, and the time between those 2 moments was what changed everything afterward. He didn't say how many minutes. He didn't say anything about the hospital. He only said that when she woke up, she was still herself, except most of what she had once learned was no longer there. He said she was 18 years old and had to learn again how to tie her shoes. Chloe asked why he hadn't told her any of this the night before. Cyrus said because last night she had been asking him about the fear of the person in room 12, and he hadn't wanted to hand her a reason before she had the chance to see the person. He told the rest more quickly. 3 months later, during a family meal, his father told everyone at the table that the girl was now a burden on the family, and it would be best to put her somewhere quiet and out of the way. Cyrus repeated the sentence exactly and added no comment. He said his father had been preparing at the time to run for a seat in city government, already had money, already had supporters, and already had 3 years invested in building his public image. He said that within 4 months of that dinner, the campaign collapsed, and he said it in exactly the same voice he'd used when talking about the 3-minute phone call. Chloe didn't ask what he'd done. She looked at him and understood that it was a question he would answer if she asked, and she decided not to ask. Cyrus said that within the year that followed, he took over the entire family operation. He said he hadn't wanted it, that before then he'd stayed outside of it for nearly 10 years, and that he'd stepped into it for one very simple reason. He said he wanted to reach a place where, from that point on, no one in his family, no one in the city, would ever dare call his sister a burden again. He said he reached that place. Then he fell silent. Chloe asked why. Then, she had been lying here for 11 months. Cyrus looked out across the lawn in front of them. He said that during those 6 years he'd paid for 3 different facilities, approved every expense, had people report back to him every month, and read those reports. He said he visited 4 times a year, sometimes 3. He said that every time he came, she didn't recognize him, and he gradually got used to that, and he allowed the time between visits to stretch a little longer with each passing year. Then he said the final sentence, and Chloe realized it was the only moment that entire morning when his voice changed. He said he had become the man the entire city had to consult before anyone did anything, and he'd become so busy that someone else buried his sister for him, and he signed the paper without reading it. At exactly 9 o'clock, Chloe opened the door to the activity room and went in first. She stood in the middle of the room until the woman sitting on the rug in the far corner looked up at her. Then she said there was a visitor today. She said it normally, without lowering her voice, without coaxing. Then she stepped aside, and Cyrus came in. He stopped at the farthest distance the room allowed. He didn't walk toward the rug. He moved along the wall to the side opposite the door, and there he sat down on the floor. He sat all the way down, both legs angled to one side, his back resting against the base of the wall, and he rolled his sleeves up to his elbows as though he wanted the room itself to see that his hands were hiding nothing. From where he sat, the path to the door was completely clear. Nadia didn't look at him. She was sitting in front of a puzzle box that had been emptied onto the rug, about 40 thick wooden pieces, and she was searching for one with a curved edge. She picked up one piece, turned it, set it down, picked up another. She did it slowly and methodically, and she'd done it almost every morning for 11 months. Chloe sat down on the rug somewhere between them, slightly closer to Nadia, and said nothing else. 3 minutes passed. Cyrus didn't speak. He didn't ask what she was playing with. He didn't say his name. He sat with his back against the wall and watched her hands turn the wooden pieces on the rug, and he let those 3 minutes pass untouched. Nadia fit one piece into the right place. She tapped it twice with her fingertips, a habit Chloe had seen hundreds of times, then looked for the next one. At the 5th minute, Cyrus began to sing. He sang very softly, so softly that Chloe had to tilt her head to hear it, and at first she thought he was speaking to himself. It wasn't English, it was an old Greek lullaby their mother used to sing to them. Chloe didn't understand a single word, but she could hear that he sang the same line twice. The melody was simple, repeating, dropping lower at the end of each line, the kind of melody written to soothe someone to sleep, rather than to be listened to. He sang 4 lines, then stopped. Nadia's hand stopped. The wooden piece remained between her fingers, about 8 inches above the rug. She didn't turn around. She didn't look up, but she stopped completely, and the entire room seemed to stop with her. Chloe held her breath. She didn't dare move, because she knew any sound now might pull the woman back into the place she'd been before. In 11 months, Chloe had seen this woman react to exactly 3 things, and all 3 had made her retreat. This was the first time Chloe had seen something make her stop. Cyrus began singing again, the same 4 lines, still just as softly, and he didn't sing faster or louder when he saw her hand stop. He sang as though he would sing those 4 lines as many times as necessary. Nadia lowered the wooden piece back onto the rug. She sat still for about 10 seconds. Then she reached out, picked up another piece from the pile in front of her, one with 2 straight edges and a right angle, and pushed it away. She pushed it with her fingertips across the rug toward the opposite wall. The wooden piece slid about 1.5 feet before stopping in the open space between her and the man sitting against the wall. She didn't turn her head to see whether he picked it up. She pulled the puzzle box closer and went back to searching for the curved piece. Cyrus looked at the wooden piece lying on the rug. He didn't rush toward it. He didn't say thank you. He shifted forward about 8 inches, just enough to reach it, and picked it up. He held it in his palm for a moment, then he placed it on the rug in front of him, the straight edge facing outward, exactly the way someone would place a piece they intended to use, and he sang the 4 lines a 3rd time. Chloe turned her face away. She did it quickly, pretending she was reaching to straighten the stack of books on the low shelf beside her, and then she stood and walked toward the window. She remained there with her back to the room for about 30 seconds. She had sat beside this woman on Saturday afternoons for 4 months. She had given her cookies, crayons, towels, cups of water. She had handed her hundreds of things. Not once had she ever been given anything back. It wasn't because Nadia hadn't wanted to give. Chloe understood that better than anyone. It was because in 11 months inside this building, no one had ever sat long enough, low enough, and quietly enough for her to have time to decide. When Chloe turned back, the 15 minutes were almost over. Cyrus was still sitting in the same place, with the wooden piece resting in front of him. Nadia still hadn't looked at him once. Chloe said time was up. Cyrus stood immediately, without hesitating for even a second, exactly as the 4th rule from the night before required. He picked up the wooden piece and walked toward the puzzle box. But he didn't go directly to Nadia. He bent down from 2 steps away and placed the piece at the edge of the rug, then stepped back. Nadia didn't react. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and said the only words he spoke during those entire 15 minutes, and he said them to Chloe, not to the woman in the room. Same time tomorrow? That afternoon, Cyrus had someone obtain the entire funeral file from the funeral home on the north side of the city. He didn't ask Vance to handle it. He called someone else, and it was the first time in 6 years that he'd given an assignment to someone other than Vance without telling him. He didn't know why he did it. He simply did. The file reached him at 7 o'clock that evening. It was thicker than he'd expected. There was a service contract, There was a cemetery selection form, Section D, row 17. There was a casket selection form, with a product code, a price, and a handwritten note in the remarks box requesting that the lid remain closed throughout the funeral. There was an authorization to release the body. There was a payment receipt. There was the death registration form filed with the city health department. 7 documents, and every one of them had a section for the family representative. Cyrus opened each page and found the signature box at the bottom. On all 7 was the same handwriting, Elias Vance. He sat with the file open on the table for about 20 minutes. Then he sent a short message telling Vance to come to the basement garage at 9 o'clock. Vance arrived at 5 minutes to 9, true to his habit of always arriving 5 minutes early. He carried his document case as usual, and the moment he stepped out of the elevator, he began talking about the management company behind the 6 facilities, saying he'd traced the ownership to the second layer, that there was a name. Cyrus raised one hand, and he stopped. Cyrus stood beside the hood of a car, and arranged across that hood were 7 sheets of paper in a row. He said nothing. He simply looked at Vance, then looked down at the papers. Vance walked over. He bent down, looked at the first page, then looked across all 7, and he didn't pick up a single one. Cyrus asked whether he recognized his own signature. Vance said yes. Cyrus asked whether he remembered signing them. Vance said he did. He said he remembered that entire afternoon, remembered the room, remembered the person sitting across from him handing him the pen. Cyrus asked whether he remembered telling him that he'd signed because Cyrus hadn't been there. Vance said he remembered. Then Cyrus asked the 4th question, and he asked it in a voice lower than the first 3. So low that in the empty garage Vance had to tilt his head to hear. "Who told you to keep the casket closed?" Vance didn't answer immediately. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Cyrus placed one hand on the edge of the hood. That was all he did. He didn't step closer, didn't raise his voice, didn't slam that hand down. He simply placed it there and left it there. And Elias Vance, who had worked beside him for 6 years and had learned how to read every silence, stepped half a pace backward without realizing he'd moved. Cyrus said he'd sat in the front row at that cemetery. He said he'd stood when they lowered the casket into the ground, and that Vance had been standing on his right. He said that for 11 months, he'd carried in his wallet a photograph of someone he believed was buried beneath the ground in Section D, row 17. And during all 11 of those months, the only person in the world who knew that the casket lid had been closed for another reason had still sat across a table from him every morning. Vance stood still. Then he spoke. He didn't deny it. He didn't say he didn't understand. He said exactly 2 sentences, and he said them clearly, like a man who had been preparing for this moment for a long time and had decided that when it finally came, he wouldn't evade it. "I was following orders, but the order didn't come from you." The garage went silent. Cyrus didn't ask him to repeat it. He didn't ask why Vance had followed someone else's orders. He didn't ask how much he'd been paid, because he looked at Vance's face and understood that this had nothing to do with money. He asked only one word. "Who?" Vance looked down at the 7 sheets of paper spread across the hood. He said there were orders in this family that a man in his position wasn't permitted to question. He said that when the order came in September the previous year, Cyrus had been gone for 3 days, and the person who gave it had enough authority to give that order during those 3 days. He said that within the organization only 3 people held that level of authority, and Cyrus was one of the 3. He said he'd believed she was dead, that he'd only been instructed to keep the lid closed, that he hadn't asked anything more, and that was a mistake he would carry with him. Cyrus said he didn't want to hear that part. He repeated the question. "Who?" Vance lifted his eyes and looked directly at him. He said the final sentence slowly, and in 6 years of working side by side, it was the only time he'd ever spoken to Cyrus Dracos in the voice of a man who pitied him, from the only person in your family you've never doubted. Konstantin Gus Dracos ate dinner at 8 o'clock every Wednesday night in the old family house on the north side of the city, and over the past 6 years, Cyrus had sat at that dining table no fewer than 200 times. That night he arrived half an hour late. His uncle had already finished the first course and was pouring his second glass when Cyrus walked in. He didn't ask why Cyrus was late. He simply pushed out the chair across from him with the toe of his shoe and told him to sit. Cyrus didn't sit. He placed 2 things on the table. The first was a copy of the death registration form. The second was the record of the trust transfer procedure, completed 41 days after the funeral, with the recipient's name printed clearly on the 3rd line. Gus looked at the 2 pages. He didn't pick them up. He took a sip, set down his glass, and said he'd been waiting for this longer than he'd expected. Cyrus asked whether he intended to deny it. Gus said no. He said he never denied the things he'd done, that Cyrus's father was the one who had always been fond of denying things, and that was why his father had never managed to hold on to anything in his life. Then he began to speak, and he spoke in the calm voice of a man explaining a perfectly reasonable business decision. He said that 6 years earlier, when Cyrus took over, he was only 32 and moving too fast. He said he'd sat at this table for 30 years and knew what happened to men who moved too quickly. He said the fund set aside for the girl was sitting there dead, earning nothing, untouchable, existing only to pay medical bills for someone who would never know how much money she had. Cyrus asked him the amount. Gus gave him the number, smoothly, without having to think. Cyrus showed no reaction. Gus continued, saying the opportunity had come in September the previous year, and he said the word opportunity without lowering his voice. He said the fire on Willow Court hadn't been his doing, that it had been a genuine accident, and that he'd simply seen something in it that could be used. He said he knew a doctor who had signed papers for him many times over the years, and that everything else had required only 4 days and a few documents. He said Cyrus had been gone for 3 of those days, and if Cyrus had been present, none of it would have happened. So when you looked at it that way, it was partly Cyrus's own fault. Cyrus asked why he hadn't simply let her die for real. And at that question, for the first time during the meal, Gus lifted his head and looked directly at him, and there was something in his eyes that looked very much like outrage. He said he wasn't that kind of man. Then he said 3 sentences without pausing. I didn't kill her. I paid to keep her for 11 months. I let her live. He said he'd chosen a decent facility, paid the full room charge every month without missing a dollar, and instructed people to keep an eye on her. He said if he'd wanted something else, he wouldn't have gone to all that trouble. He said the girl still ate, still slept, still had a bed, and she didn't even know where she was, so she hadn't lost anything. He asked Cyrus whether he truly believed she could tell one facility from another. Then he lifted his glass and said his final sentence. He said he'd given her a life, and in return he'd taken money she didn't know how to use anyway. Cyrus stood motionless at the end of the table. He didn't slam his hand against the wood. He didn't knock over the glass. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at the 61-year-old man, sitting in front of him eating dinner. The man who had taught him how to tie a necktie. The man who had stood on his left at the funeral. And he felt something very strange, something that was almost calm. He bent down, picked up the 2 sheets of paper from the table, folded them in half, and slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he straightened and fastened the button of his jacket. He said exactly 1 sentence to his uncle, and he said it very quietly, and Gus Dracos would hear that sentence again and again inside his head over the weeks that followed. You just said you let her live as if that were a gift you gave her. Gus didn't answer. Cyrus walked out of the dining room, through the hallway, and out the front door. He didn't slam it behind him. He closed it very gently. At 11:40 that night, Chloe Whitaker was sitting cross-legged on the bed in her rented room, holding a cup of noodles in one hand and looking at the screen of her phone. She had installed the internal monitoring system application 3 months earlier, after realizing that if she didn't keep watch herself, no one else was going to do it for her. She had viewing access only, no permission to save anything. She opened it almost every night. The window for room 12 was always in the upper left corner, and it was always the first one she checked. The phone vibrated in her hand. A notification appeared in the middle of the screen in red letters, written in the system's dry, impersonal language. Room 12 camera signal lost. Chloe arrived at Ridgeline at 12:15. She had driven 20 minutes in her pajamas with a sweater pulled over them, and she'd rung the staff entrance bell 3 times before anyone came to open the door. The lobby lights were on. There were 3 people in the lobby. Ruth Hollis stood beside the reception desk holding a stack of papers, and she was still wearing the same clothes she'd had on during the day even though it was well past midnight. 2 men stood 1 step away from her. They wore windbreakers and plastic badges printed with the name of a medical transport company, and a folded wheelchair stood beside their feet. Chloe asked what was happening. Ruth Hollis held out the papers for her to see instead of answering. It was a facility transfer order. It had the name Nina Hale. It had the resident identification number. The stated reason for transfer was specialized care needs. Dr. Adrian Pike's signature appeared in the medical supervisor box, dated that day. And in the box at the bottom, the most important box, was the signature of the court-appointed guardian, written in the same hand Chloe had seen on the paper left behind at the printer in April. Everything on that page was in order. Chloe said transferring a resident in the middle of the night was unusual. One of the two men said that was how their vehicle schedule worked. Chloe said she wanted to call Dr. Pike. Ruth Hollis said she'd already called him 40 minutes earlier, and he'd confirmed the transfer. Chloe looked at the director and asked whether she thought any of this was normal. Ruth Hollis didn't answer that question. She said that if the paperwork was valid, the facility had no authority to hold the resident there. She said it twice, the second time more quietly than the first, and Chloe understood that Ruth knew perfectly well something was wrong and wasn't going to do anything about it. The two men started toward the east hallway. Chloe moved ahead of them. She walked faster, turned into the corridor first, and stood in the middle of the doorway to room 12 with her back against the closed door and her arms hanging at her sides. The man in front stopped about 3 feet away. He said she was obstructing a lawful procedure. Chloe said she was the nurse on duty, and she was responsible for the resident in that room. He raised the transfer papers. Chloe said she'd called the police. She said it clearly, not fast, without trembling. She said she'd called at 12:10, that she'd reported strangers trying to remove a resident from the facility in the middle of the night, and that officers were on the way. It was a lie. She hadn't called anyone. The two men looked at each other. 15 seconds passed in that hallway and no one moved. Chloe stared directly at the man closest to her and didn't blink, and she thought about what she would do if they took one more step, and she knew the answer was that there was nothing she could do. The second man pulled out his phone and walked several steps away to make a call. That was the opening Chloe needed. To her right, less than 6 feet away, was the fire alarm pull station mounted on the wall. She reached over and pulled the lever. The alarm screamed through the building. The hallway lights switched into emergency mode. Room doors began opening. Night staff came running out. Residents started moving into the corridor amid the organized confusion of an evacuation they'd all practiced dozens of times. Under the roar of the alarm, Chloe opened the door to room 12 and went inside. Nadia was sitting upright on the bed with both hands covering her ears. Chloe knelt beside the bed, lowering herself beneath Nadia's eye level, and said exactly one sentence. "Come with me." Nadia looked at her. Then she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of Chloe's sweater, exactly as she had the morning before, and she let Chloe help her out of bed. Chloe wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She led her the opposite way, toward the far end of the east hallway, to the emergency exit every posted rule said was for fire use only. She pushed the crash bar. The door flew open. Outside was the lawn behind the building, and farther beyond it was the employee parking lot. Chloe's 2009 Corolla was parked in the second row, and she'd parked in that second row for 4 months because it was the closest row to the emergency exit. She opened the rear door, helped Nadia inside, fastened her seatbelt, and shut the door. Then she got behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking so badly that it took her 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. She drove out of the lot while the alarm was still screaming behind her, and she didn't turn on the headlights until she reached the main road. 4 miles later, at a red light on Route 69, Chloe looked into the rearview mirror. Nadia was sitting quietly in the back seat with the blanket pulled up to her chin, eyes open, looking out the window. She wasn't crying. She didn't ask where they were going. And Chloe, both hands gripping the steering wheel, began calculating. She couldn't go back to Ridgeline. She couldn't take Nadia to her rented room, because that would be the first address anyone could find. She couldn't go to a hospital because the hospital would check the system, and the system would return the guardian's name. She couldn't go to a police station because at the police station they would read the document bearing Dr. Pike's signature and see that the person breaking the law that night was her. The light turned green. Chloe didn't move immediately. She sat there for another 2 seconds and realized the thing she'd been trying not to think about for the last 4 miles. There was exactly one person left in the world powerful enough to protect both people inside this car. And that person was being hunted by an entire federal agency. Ridgeline called the police at 1 o'clock in the morning. The report stated that an employee had removed a ward from the facility during a fire alarm without authorization and had left for an unknown location. Ruth Hollis signed the report. At 7 o'clock that morning, the state nursing board issued an emergency suspension of Chloe Whitaker's nursing license pending investigation. At 8 o'clock, her employee identification photograph appeared on the local station's morning news. At 9:15, Chloe was sitting in a roadside diner in western Lancaster County, 70 miles from Philadelphia, ordering 2 plates of eggs and pancakes. Nadia finished her own meal and then ate half of Chloe's. The television mounted in the corner of the diner was playing the morning news with the volume low and captions running across the bottom of the screen. Chloe's photograph appeared. The anchor said authorities were searching for a female nurse described as showing signs of psychological instability, and that the family of the ward had expressed concern for the patient's safety. Chloe sat still and watched the captions run to the end of the sentence. Then Nadia looked up at the screen and pointed. "That's Chloe." Then she smiled. She truly smiled, delighted to see someone she knew on television, and she turned toward Chloe to share the happiness of it. Chloe nodded and said, "Yes, that's me." She finished her coffee, then went to the counter and paid in cash. The woman found her at 11 o'clock in the parking lot of a motel 3 miles from the diner. She came alone, without handcuffs, without backup vehicles. She showed her badge and said her name was Karen Mercer, a federal agent. She said she'd found the Corolla through gas station cameras, that the state police would locate it in about 2 hours, and that she'd come first because she wanted to talk. Chloe looked toward the motel room window behind her, where Nadia was sitting inside watching television. Mercer said Chloe could sit in her car or sit on the steps, whichever she preferred. Chloe chose the steps. Mercer said she knew Chloe hadn't kidnapped anyone. She said she'd read Chloe's employment history, knew what had happened at the old hospital 2 years earlier, and didn't believe someone like Chloe had suddenly decided to abduct a patient in the middle of the night. Then she made her proposal. She said her office could sit down with the district attorney and make every criminal charge against Chloe disappear within 48 hours. She said the nursing board would receive a confirming letter and Chloe's license would be reinstated. Chloe asked what she wanted in return. Mercer said she'd spent 3 years building a case against Cyrus Dracos and still hadn't found a single witness willing to open their mouth. She said Chloe was in a position none of her agents could reach. Then she said the words recording device. Chloe didn't answer immediately. She looked across the parking lot for a long time. Then she said no. She said that man had sat outside the lobby for 2 hours when she'd told him he couldn't go in, and he'd stood up the moment she told him the visit was over. And she wasn't going to wear a recording device to meet someone who had done exactly what she'd asked him to do. She said she didn't know what he'd done out there, and she wasn't defending any of it, but she wasn't the person who was going to do this. Mercer asked what she intended to do instead. Chloe pulled her phone from her pocket. She placed it on the step between them, unlocked it, and opened the folder named Shift Charts. She said there were 27 videos inside, recorded from April through July, in Ridgeline's east hallway and dining room. She didn't explain what was in them. She let Mercer tap the first one herself. Mercer watched the entire first clip, then opened the second, and she said nothing for 4 minutes. Chloe kept talking while she watched. She said the camera at the corner of the east hallway had been broken for 7 weeks. She said she had photographs of 3 consecutive staff meeting minutes, all of them stating that the camera was still awaiting maintenance by the contractor. Then she opened a second folder and said she also had photographs of the expense statements posted in the staff room. And every month, those statements included a line item for surveillance system maintenance, and the amount hadn't decreased at all during those 7 weeks. She said she'd photographed those statements every month for 4 months, not because she understood them, but because something didn't add up, and she didn't know who to give them to. Mercer looked up from the screen. She asked who approved those statements. Chloe said the final line of every statement carried the name of the person responsible for medical approval, and that name was Dr. Adrian Pike. She said he approved them for all 6 facilities. Mercer placed the phone down on the step. Chloe delivered her final sentence slowly. "You're hunting the wrong animal. The man draining money from this state's disabled people doesn't drive an armored car. He signs death certificates." Karen Mercer left the motel parking lot at 12:30. She didn't arrest Chloe. She didn't promise her anything either. She only said she needed 48 hours and told Chloe not to change cars. Cyrus Dracos arrived at the motel at 7 o'clock that evening, alone, driving a car that wasn't his. Chloe had texted him the room number that afternoon, after sitting for an hour staring at her phone without pressing send. He knocked twice, then stepped back and waited for Chloe to open the door. He entered the room, looked at Nadia sitting on the bed watching cartoons, and didn't go toward her. He sat in the chair near the door and stayed there until she fell asleep about 2 hours later. Then he and Chloe went outside to the concrete step in front of the room, sat down, and left the door open a crack so they could hear what was happening inside. Night had settled completely, and there was only one light burning in the parking lot. Cyrus asked whether Nadia had been able to eat. Chloe said she had, and a lot at that. She said Nadia had slept 4 hours in the car, and hadn't asked a single question about where she was. He nodded. Then he said he'd had people working since that afternoon. He said the management company that controlled the 6 facilities was having cash flow problems, and he could buy the entire operation within a few weeks. He said he would shut Ridgeline down, replace the entire management team, and build a new facility on the north side of the city, designed specifically for Nadia, with 3 times the staffing ratio, and he would name it after her. He said all of it in the voice of a man who had already finished calculating the numbers. Chloe sat quietly and listened to everything. She let him finish completely, without interrupting even once. Then she said there was something she wanted to tell him, and she was going to say it plainly because she was too tired to speak around it. She said that building wasn't the problem. Cyrus turned to look at her. Chloe continued. She said, "You can buy this entire building. You can buy this entire state if you want to, but you can't buy back those 3 minutes. No one can." She said there were 40 other people at Ridgeline, and what had ruined that place wasn't the roof or the number of rooms. It was the fact that for 7 weeks, no one had bothered to repair a camera. She said that for the past 2 days, she'd watched him do everything like a man paying off a debt. And those 3 minutes were a debt that could never be repaid. And if he kept trying to repay it, he would spend the rest of his life making amends to someone who didn't even know she was being made amends to. Then she said the last part more slowly. "So stop trying to make it up to her. Just stay. That girl doesn't need a boss. She needs a brother who knows how to walk into a room without frightening her." Cyrus didn't say anything for a very long time. Chloe thought she'd gone too far. Then he asked her a question she hadn't expected. He asked why she'd texted him that afternoon. Chloe said because she had no one else. She said she'd sat staring at her phone for an hour before pressing send. Cyrus said he knew. He said he wanted to ask about the rest. He said the woman from the Federal Bureau had reached her before he had, and he knew what she'd offered, because it was the only thing she had to offer. He asked why Chloe had refused. Chloe said she hadn't refused because of him. She said she'd refused because 2 years earlier she'd signed her real name to a piece of paper to tell the truth, and she wasn't going to put a recording device on herself and take the truth from someone that way. She said if she did, she wouldn't be any different from the people who had buried her report. Cyrus looked out across the parking lot. Then he said something he'd never said to anyone before. He said there were about 30 people in that city willing to die for him. He said he knew every one of their names, knew how many children they had, knew what they needed. Then he said that not one of those 30 people had ever done anything for him at a time when he had nothing to give in return. Chloe didn't answer that. She looked down at her hands. Inside the room, the television was still playing softly. Cyrus said he'd sat in the garage the night before last and listened to a man he'd trusted for 6 years tell him the order hadn't come from him. He said that the previous night he'd stood at the end of a dining table and listened to his own uncle describe allowing his sister to live as if it were a gift. He said that during those 2 nights he'd understood something. He said he'd spent 6 years building something capable of protecting everyone, and that thing had become the only place in the world from which someone could bury his sister without him knowing. Chloe asked him one final question. She asked what he was going to do now. Cyrus didn't answer immediately. He stood, brushed off his sleeves, and looked toward the narrow opening of the motel room door, where the pale blue light from the television spilled through. Then he spoke. "The one thing my uncle never thought I'd dare to do." Elias Vance received the call at 6 o'clock the next morning. Cyrus gave him exactly one instruction: build the entire money trail, from my uncle to Adrian Pike, from Pike to all 6 facilities. 11 months, not one payment missing. Vance was silent for several seconds, then asked whether Cyrus understood where that trail would lead. He said the money didn't move in a straight line. It ran through 3 family companies, through 2 accounts Cyrus himself had authorized to be opened, and through 1 payment Vance had personally processed 3 years earlier. He said that if he reconstructed the whole thing, it wouldn't only bring down Gus Dracos, it would also tear open a section the federal government had spent 3 years trying and failing to find. Cyrus asked whether he could do it. Vance said he could. Cyrus said, "Then do it." Vance asked whether he was sure. Cyrus said, "I'm not asking for your opinion." Vance didn't ask another question. It took 40 hours. Vance worked with 2 accountants in a windowless room and didn't sleep. On Saturday night, a file 170 pages thick was placed on a table inside a restaurant on 9th Street that had already closed for the night. The chairs turned upside down on the tables, only 1 row of lights left on. Karen Mercer came alone. She sat down and didn't touch the file for the first 3 minutes. She asked why her, and why now. Cyrus said, because you're the only person in 3 years who never tried to buy anyone in my organization. Mercer opened the file. She read the first section. The money trail from the family trust to a medical consulting company registered a name of Adrian Pike's wife, paid regularly every quarter for 3 years. The second section contained fraudulent expenses from the 6 facilities, including the surveillance system maintenance charges Chloe had photographed, compared against a contractor agreement that had expired the previous year. The third section contained the records of the court-appointed guardian who was legally responsible for 31 people across 4 different facilities, with a monthly fee deducted from Medicaid funding for every person under that guardianship. The fourth section was Nadia Drakos's death file, including the confirmation Pike had sent to the medical examiner's office and the record of the trust transfer completed 41 days after the funeral. And the fifth section, the thickest, contained the account routes Vance had reconstructed, marked in red wherever they passed through 3 companies bearing the Dracos name. Mercer read the 5th section for a very long time. Then she looked up and asked, "Do you know what you just gave me?" Cyrus said he did. She asked where his lawyer was. He said there was no lawyer. She asked what he wanted. Cyrus said 2 things. First, every criminal charge against Chloe Whitaker is dropped, and your office sends a letter to the nursing board stating clearly that she did the right thing. Second, my sister's name doesn't appear in any public record. No indictment, no witness list, no press release. Mercer asked if there was anything else. Cyrus said that's all. He said he wasn't asking for immunity, wasn't asking for leniency, and wasn't placing any conditions on the part that concerned him personally. She rested her hand on the file and looked at him for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer the voice of an agent doing her job. "You're handing over your own family in exchange for a nurse and a medical record." Cyrus didn't answer. He stood and fastened the button of his coat. Mercer said she would need him to sit down with her office many times, on the record, with everything recorded and his attorney beside him, and that what was inside that file would eventually point back at him. Cyrus said he knew. Then he walked to the door. At 4 o'clock on Sunday morning, he arrived at the old family house on the north side of the city. Gus Drakos opened the door in his pajamas and didn't look surprised. Cyrus didn't go inside. He stood on the front step and said the file had been turned over Saturday night. He said the search warrants would be executed at 8 o'clock that morning. He said Gus had 4 hours. Gus asked 4 hours for what? Cyrus said not to run, because if he ran he'd be arrested at the airport before lunch, and there was nothing dignified about that. He said the 4 hours were for him to call his attorney, get dressed, and walk out of that door on his own feet, instead of being led away in front of the neighbors. Gus stood still for a very long time. Then he said Cyrus had just destroyed what 3 generations of their family had built because of a girl who couldn't even remember his name. He asked whether Cyrus understood that she would never be grateful to him. He asked whether Cyrus understood that tomorrow she would still sit in the exact same place, doing the exact same thing, and nothing inside her mind would have changed at all. Cyrus looked at his uncle and answered in an ordinary voice, without raising it at all. "She remembers my name. She just doesn't remember what I became. That's the only decent thing left in this family." Then he turned and walked down the steps. Behind him, the door closed very slowly. The indictment was made public 3 weeks later. Adrian Pike, Ruth Hollis, Wade Toller, and the court-appointed guardian were charged with Medicaid fraud, falsifying medical records, and abuse of guardianship authority. Konstantin Drakos faced the most serious group of charges. All 6 facilities were placed into court-ordered receivership, and Ridgeline was the first to be taken over. The Dracos Family Charitable Foundation provided the money for the reforms, but Cyrus wasn't the person who wrote the new standards of care. He handed Chloe a stack of blank paper and told her that he knew nothing about this work, while the person who did was sitting right in front of him. Chloe wrote for 9 days. She wrote that the maximum staffing ratio would be 10 residents to 1 nurse on the day shift and 8 residents to 1 nurse at night. She wrote that hallway cameras had to be inspected every week, and if any device remained broken for more than 72 hours, it had to be reported to the board of directors. She created a whistleblower hotline operated by an independent outside organization, one that didn't pass through facility management. And on the final page, she wrote the clause she had spent a very long time trying to find the courage to put into words, that any employee who reported abuse would receive legal protection paid for by the facility, even if the report was later determined to lack sufficient evidence. She handed the papers to him. Cyrus read every page. Then he said, "You write it, I'll sign it." As for Nadia, the court didn't grant him guardianship. The judge ruled that a biological brother involved in ongoing federal proceedings wasn't an appropriate guardian, and appointed a neutral guardian nominated by the state's Protective Services Office. Cyrus was allowed 2 visits each week. He didn't appeal. He wasn't allowed to own his sister. He was only allowed to be there. 6 weeks after the indictment, on a Saturday morning, Cyrus was caught in road construction on the highway and arrived at the new facility 3 minutes late. He pushed open the activity room door, and Nadia was sitting on the rug with the puzzle box emptied in front of her. She looked up at him. Then she said, "Cy, you're late." Cyrus stopped in the doorway. He turned his face away and looked down the hallway for about 10 seconds, and Chloe, standing in the corner of the room, said nothing. 6 years earlier, an 18-year-old girl had sat in a car waiting for her brother to drive her to an exam, and he'd come down 3 minutes late. The part of her mind that had remained trapped for the past 6 years was still there on that morning, still sitting inside that car, still waiting. And that was why, in the ridgeline hallway that morning, when she lifted her face from the floor and spoke her first words after 11 months of silence, an entire hallway full of strangers had fallen still, and the most powerful man in Philadelphia had gone white. Chloe Whitaker's nursing license was restored the following month after Special Agent Karen Mercer's office sent a letter of confirmation to the state nursing board. Every criminal charge against her was dropped. She accepted the position of director of care at the new facility. And the first thing she did was post her standards on the wall of the staff room, where everyone could read them. Cyrus Dracos signed a cooperation agreement at the end of that year. He pleaded guilty to the financial charges, received 18 months of probation, forfeited part of his assets, and permanently withdrew from the Port District. His conviction wasn't erased. He didn't claim that he had changed either. He simply signed the papers and walked out. That afternoon, after everything was finished, he went to the facility and asked Chloe whether he could come on Saturday mornings. He asked it like a real question, not an announcement. Chloe looked at him and said it would be better if he came 10 minutes early. For the next 3 weeks, he arrived 10 minutes early. He sat down on the floor, rolled up his sleeves, and let Nadia teach him how to do puzzles. She told him which piece belonged with which, and she was wrong almost every time, and he followed her instructions anyway, and the two of them laughed when the finished picture didn't look like anything at all. This story leaves us with a few things worth thinking about. The value of a human being isn't measured by how much they can remember, how much they can do, or how much they can give back to us. Nadia couldn't remember what her brother had sacrificed for her, and that didn't make her any less worthy of love. Power is only worth as much as what it protects. A person who has everything but can't protect the people they love truly has nothing at all. And in the end, the person who genuinely changes something is often not the strongest one, but the one who still chooses kindness, even when they know no one will see it, and they will receive nothing in return. For 4 months, Chloe hid half of her breakfast inside her coat pocket, without ever imagining that one day anyone would know. If this story moved something inside you, leave us a comment and tell us what you think, and whether you've ever met someone like Chloe in real life. Please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. We look forward to reading the thoughts you share from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.